evening, Third Baptist. It is so good to be with you all this evening virtually in this remote environment. My name is Melissa Champs. I go by Minister Mel, and I'm here before you today to talk about safety in unknown places. So before we get into it, let's go before the Lord in prayer. God, our Creator, the lover of our souls, we come to you saying thank you for this time that we have together. Thank you that you have made ways for us to stay connected in this remote environment. And thank you that your word still goes forth regardless of what's happening in the world. Your word can still penetrate the hearts of your people and cause action that you would be pleased with and that you would be glorified by. So God, we ask as we study this word today, as we reflect on this biblical passage, that you would just enlighten us, open our hearts, that we would receive what you have for us today. Lord, we thank you for what you've done and what you are yet still doing. Even those things that we have yet to see, we believe that you will answer the prayers. So God, we adore you, we love you, and we honor you in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. Safety in unknown places. As I begin to reflect on this theme, this is the same theme that we've been praying about throughout this week, safety in unknown places. I sat before the Lord to see what he would have for his people around this topic, and my heart was led to the 23rd Psalm. And we all know that psalm so well, and it's one that brings joy to our hearts. As we read it, we're reminded of the goodness of the Lord and how he protects and guides. So I'm going to read that for our hearing today. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still water. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valleys of the shadows of death, I will feel no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me, even in the presence of mine enemy. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That is the 23rd Psalm. We all know it. We all love it. And there are certain parts of it that make us feel good, that warms our hearts when we think about the 23rd Psalm and what it has to offer the people of God as we listen and as we hear of it. But there's some other things embedded in the 23rd Psalm that I want to draw our attention to today. Things that sometimes we look over. And so for the sake of the short time that we have, I want to focus on one specific verse. And we're going to have this reflective time over that one verse. And that's verse 4. I'll read it again for your hearing. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. As we think about the 23rd Psalm, we think about the beauty in it, but there's some darkness in it too. And how befitting that we focus on the darkness in this psalm right now as we wrestle with the unknowns of current civilization, as we wrestle with this health pandemic, and as we wrestle with civil unrest in our communities and across the world. How befitting is it that we focus on verse 4 right now, walking through the valleys of the shadow of death. Let's take a moment for a second and think about that first half of the verse. Yea, though I walk through the valleys of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Let's talk about David for a moment. The more I study David, the more I learn that he's no stranger to unknown territory. He's no stranger to moments of anxiety and fear. You know, whether it was caused by himself or whether it was caused by other people, he is no stranger to that. If we take a moment and examine his life, we'll see that there were times where adversities were brought on by others, like the time where he was haunted for slaughtered by Saul due to Saul's jealousy of him. He was haunted to be slaughtered. Take that in for a moment. There were even times when he may have brought on some of that anguish himself, like the time where he committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband, Uriah. All of this due to his own lust and his own greed. Regardless of what he experienced, whether it was at the hand of someone else or at the hand of himself or decision making, We know that David had experienced a lot of anguish and turmoil in his life. He had to learn many things about the God that he served. He was no stranger to unknown territory, literally or metaphorically. There were times when he was amidst trials and circumstances that he didn't know what the outcome would be. Take some time and read the life of David, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But as we think about this very specific passage, I believe that David had made a point in his life. At the point he sat down to write this passage, he had made it to a point in his life that regardless of what he faced, regardless of the experiences that he encountered, regardless of what he had gone through or had seen, he was making a declaration before us today that he wasn't going to fear. I want to put that before us today as we go through these uncertain times and as we begin to face the fourth quarter of this year, as we go back to work, as we go back to school. Many of you will be starting new schools and starting either grade school or high school or grammar school or even college for the first time. There are many unknowns. Many of you will be returning to work amidst this pandemic. There are so many unknowns, so many uncertainties. However, there is a blessing that lies in this passage for us today. And that's the choice that we have to choose not to fear. And choosing not to fear, that does not exclude the fact that there are things to fear. There are many things to fear as we continue to live and continue to move and continue to find ways to make our place and our presence known in the earth. There are many things to fear. But this passage reminds us that David made it an attempt not to fear. And I think we can take a valuable lesson here. David speaks in verse 4 about these valleys of shadows of death. And so I want to highlight the valley for us today as we spend this time together. There are many unknowns about valleys. When we think about valleys, there are literally depths and there are highs and lows within valleys. The valley itself is lower than the hills, but it too has these dips in and out of it, which may cause for some high and low or level grounds. And there's no way to really know what you're going to experience in the valley until you get there. Because it's low and it has these crevices, it's in the crevices of the earth, there's darkness to the valley as well. There are these moments where we can't see our way through valleys. And because it has peaks, there are also some times in valleys where we get that sunlight and when we can see exactly what's on the other end or the other side of the valley. I'd like for us to think about that for a moment, that God literally chose a place, Israel, to begin our spiritual journey with him, a place that has highs and lows, which is indicative to what we would experience in life, highs and lows, hills and valleys. And David was amidst these hills and valleys throughout his life and throughout his journey and experience in the wilderness and throughout his life with the Lord. I had a chance to study abroad in Israel, and when I studied there, I got to visit a space called the Negev, and it's the wilderness, it's the desert of the land where the Bible tells us that there's barren land. And the Negev is a part of that barren land. There's nothing growing there. It's very hard to get water there. It's really a dry land. It's the desert. And I got a chance to visit there to see with my own physical eye what that looked like. It's barren. It's dry. There's not a lot of life happening there. And if there is life there, it's literally fighting to hold on and to continue to exist. And David spent a lot of his time in this location, in the wilderness, in the desert, the Negev. He spent a lot of his time there shepherding sheep. He even spent some time there hiding from the various things that came up against him, Saul being one. And so he was very familiar with this space, However, there were some uncertainties about it too, some unknown parts of the valley that, he didn't necessarily know how to navigate. And I want to draw your attention to that. And as I thought about that and having that experience and journeying through the Negev and learning about that space and what happens in that space, by it being dry and barren, it's hard to experience growth. And if we think closely about what life has given us in 2020, sometimes we can be bombarded with the fact that it was hard to produce growth, that we miss the reality that there was still some growth and that there was still moments in 2020 where we were able to regroup and we were able to shift our focus and we were able to be restored. So that also happens in the valley. And so as we focus on this passage and we hear from David about what he experienced in the valley, I want you to think about some very real and tangible things that occurred in Israel's valleys. There's something called a flash flood. And for those of you who aren't familiar with flash floods, it's literally a moment in time where water comes into a space and it comes rushing in and it comes with all of its might and it literally floods that area. I already mentioned to you guys that Israel's filled with hills and valleys. There's the Judean hills and there's the Negev Valley. And in that space of the Judean hills, the rain falls. Rain doesn't fall throughout all seasons in Israel, but it falls at a very particular time. It doesn't fall in the summer seasons, but it falls towards the fall and the winter seasons. October is when they begin to experience rainfall, and it starts with a light shower, and then it begins to pick up. By the time you get to December, January, there's the heavier falls, and that rain would fall throughout that period. And as that rain would fall, they would experience the rain in the Judean hills. They would know that it was raining in the Judean hills, and the crops would benefit from it in the Judean hills. But there was this other portion where the rain was not experienced, and that's the Negev. In the Negev, in the valley, the rain was not experienced. It wasn't until days later that the people in the Negev, in the valley, would know that there was even some rain. And they would know that there was some rain because out of nowhere, a flash flood would come. And this flood would come and it would continue to pick up the momentum as it came down the Judean hills, pick up the momentum. The water from the rain would begin to run down the hills. And before you know it, those who were in the valley would experience this flash flood, and it would come out of nowhere and literally either wipe them away, crush them into the rocks of the valley, and they would be no more. This is still a real reality of those in Israel. And if you weren't prepared for the valley would demolish you. The valley would be your demise. So I would like to propose that idea to you all today, that David was very familiar with the times and very familiar with the rainfalls and with the valleys and what you would experience if you were in the valley. And he posed this psalm for us today, that yea, though I walk through the valleys of the shadow of death, I would fear no evil. He knew that the valleys had shadows of death lurking, and he didn't know what could or would happen at any given moment. But what I want to draw your attention to today is that he chose not to fear. And the reason why he chose not to fear is because he knew that the Lord was with him. And for us today, as we go through these turbulent times, we are to hold fast to the reality and the ideal that the Lord is with us. His rod and his staff continues to comfort us even today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what the rod and the staff is, shepherds have this tool of a rod and staff that they use to guide the sheep. They use the curve of the rod to guide them back into safety if they're in harm's way. The staff itself is direction to the sheep, guides them, points them in areas that they should go. This is both literal and metaphorical, that the shepherd would use the rod for guidance and for protection The shepherd would also use the rod as a resting tool. It could hold him up when he's weak or when he's tired. That very same rod and staff is available to us today. The rod and the staff of the Lord, in a very metaphorical sense and literal sense, is available today to us to guide us, to lead us, to keep us out of harm's way, to be our safety in unknown places. So when fear arises, because the word never told us that fear would not arise. The word just told us that God has not given us the spirit of fear. He's given us the spirit of a sound mind, love, and a sound mind. But fear still exists. But we have a choice today that though we walk through these valleys of uncertainty as we approach this new season, this fall season of life, as we start school, as we go back to work, as we navigate this pandemic in our family life, we have a choice to make as we even navigate this civil unrest. We have a choice to make, and that choice is to fear not, for the Lord is with us. David didn't stop working as a shepherd. He continued to work, but he chose to do it without fear. We must still work now while it's day. We must still gather up the harvest. We must still do those things that God has called us to do, even though we are in uncertain times, even though there is much to fear. There is much to fear, but we must choose today to fear not, because there is safety. There is safety in the arms of the Lord. And we must remember that during these times, and we must hold fast to that. And we must continue to move. We must continue to work. We must continue to stand in these uncertain times. We must continue to use our voice and allow it to be the light and the guidance that people need in this present day. We must remember to stand and be counted. We must remember to stand and use our voices and vote. We must remember to be what Christ has called us to be. Even in these uncertain times, there is safety in his arms. Thank you for being with me today. Thank you for allowing me to present this reflection to you. Thank you for allowing me to share. I pray that it will touch your hearts and that it will cause some movement, that we will remember not to fear, but to remember that the Lord is with us and we can do all things through him that gives us strength. So thank you for this time. Remember to follow us on Facebook and on YouTube, like all of our social media channels, and remember to even check our website for updates. It was so good to be before you today. This concludes this Wednesday's At the Well. There is safety in unknown places.